You are listening to Woodland Walks, a podcast for the Woodland Trust, presented by Adam Shaw. We protect and plant trees for people to enjoy, to fight climate change and to help wildlife thrive.
Well, I've been for a pre-Christmas walk in an urban woodland to meet Jon Drori CBE. Amongst many other things, he's an ambassador for the Woodland Trust, and he is author of the best-selling Around the World in 80 Trees and the newly published Around the World in 80 Plants. And he started by talking to me about why urban landscapes can be more diverse environmentally than rural ones.
We spend quite a bit of our time in Dorset. And oddly enough, this little corner of London is much more diverse than Dorset is. Dorset is full of arable farming, and all the chemicals they use on the land and so on, that mean that other than the hedgerows, there's really not a whole lot of biodiversity there. It's a bit of a green desert.
Right.
Whereas Parliament Hill and Hampstead Heath are really very diverse. Lots of different species here, lots of lovely birds. Quite a lot of wildlife really as well.
Right. Now you do a lot with the natural world. I mean, we'll get on to the amazing books you've published and written and all the other things you do. But it always strikes me as unusual, or not what you'd predict, because your early background is very much technology based. You wouldn't have predicted you'd become a tree man.
Thinking about it, my father had been had studied botany first off, and then had changed to engineering because that's what people needed, just around the wartime. When I was little, I remember we grew up around southwest London, and we used to go all the time to sorry, it's a bit muddy here, is that all right?
Yes,
Yeah.
But it's great. Look, we're outdoors.
Yeah.
And I've put on my big walking boots, so it's fine.
That's just as well. We're going to be sliding in a minute. So we'll just if we go across here and then back on. And my parents used to take my brother and me to Kew Gardens kind of almost every week. And I think that plants really were their first love. My father was particularly interested in the science, the botany and the horticulture. My mother, I remember when she died at a ripe old age, we looked in her purse and she had one of those sort of jeweller's loop magnifying glasses, which she used all the time to look at the tiny structures in plants.
Wow.
And what she was interested in was the beauty that was there, the sort of hidden beauty.
Yes.
And so between them we had this kind of science and beauty outlook on plants.
Because there is that thing, I mean, about the beauty of things. I have in my car some sort of dried moss that I picked off on a walk around Scotland. And I do see it as a piece of jewellery. I just think, God, if you just made that out of metal, you'd very nicely make a lovely sort of necklace or something, or key ring. And I just think sometimes we don't take a moment to look at the things around us, because they can be beautiful.
Yes, and I particularly like the kind of hidden beauty. So when you look at your moss, and you really look at the detail perhaps of the magnifying glass, you see the most sort of amazing things there. Or another thing that I suggest that people do sometimes is to just look at a plant, really observe it. It's a sort of, I mean, it sounds rather a kind of trendy mindfulness kind of thing, but I don't really mean it that way. But just sort of really think about the plant and why it's evolved in the way that it has. Why has your pot plant got, leaves that are this shape rather than that shape, or flowers that are one shape rather than another?
There's a tree, a dead tree. Shall we just use that to sit down for a moment?
Sorry,
we can have a chat. No, it's good but as you say, I find it increasingly difficult to talk and walk, and this will give us a moment to have a look around. Are you good at identifying trees?
Not brilliant, especially not in winter when they're
yes, very hard.
when there's no leaves. So there are some where you can immediately tell from the shape, but others where it's really quite hard at this time of year.
I have brought along a a volunteer or a victim, I don't know, a young friend of the family is called Leila, who's got some own questions for you. Is that okay? Yeah. All right, go on. You ask the questions and I'll just hold the mic.
How would you say climate change affects trees?
Well, climate change is really difficult for trees because, if you think about it, these trees have evolved to be in a place which has a particular amount of water and a particular amount of heat and cold and a relationship with lots of other organisms that are around. And if anything comes and changes that, then trees have this sort of super long life cycle, so they can't adapt quickly to those changes. So sometimes what you get with a change in climate, a rapid change that we have now, is that all the little kind of critters, the little insects and things that the tree might depend on for pollination, or the birds that it depends on to disperse the seeds, they might not be around when the tree needs them to do those things. And if they're not, then the tree can't reproduce. So effectively it would die out. So that's a real link between climate change and trees.
How would you say future generations could help save the environment?
Well, there are lots of things we can do. One is protect the environment that we've got, stop people building on it unnecessarily, maintain as much biodiversity as possible, so encourage lots of different species around the place, consume less. Our consumption as a species is one of the things that drives habitat loss, whether it's in this country or abroad somewhere. So just consuming less stuff really helps. And on the subject of consumption, if we can stop ourselves from eating so much meat, that really helps, because a lot of land is given over to growing soy and corn and other crops that are not primarily for feeding humans, but they're for feeding animals that we then eat, and that's terribly inefficient.
So would you say planting new forests would help that?
Planting new forests is generally a good thing to do, but you have to plant the right trees in the right places. So if we look out over Hampstead Heath here and suddenly planted a whole load of eucalyptuses, that's probably not a good thing to do, because they're not native species, so they wouldn't have a relationship with the insects and wildlife and so on. It'd just be a sort of dead zone. And also, it would be, Hampstead Heath is a heath, and that's what it's kind of meant to be. So we wouldn't want to plant on peatland, for example, which sequesters a lot of carbon and does a lot of good for the environment. But some of the denuded moorland and sort of upper downs, as we call them, those are places that used to have trees and don't anymore. And large-scale forestation with native species would be a great thing to do.
Leila, can you hold this whilst I try and sit on this tree?
Sure.
But I may fall over. Or I may not get on it at all. Oh my God.
What could go wrong here?
Oh, yes,
this is quite difficult, isn't it?
Yes. Okay.
Okay.
There we are. Thank you. Leila, thank you very much. Okay.
I've got a very cold bottom.
Yes,
now.
A cold bottom. If I fall off, you have to take over the interview. Is that all right? So, Jon, you've most recently published Around the World in 80 Trees.
Actually, the most recent one is Around the World in 80 Plants.
In 80 plants,
but
of course.
Previously, Around the World in 80 Trees. Yes.
And the Around the World in 80 Plants, is it Waterstone's Book of the Year?
It's shortlisted for Waterstone's Book of the Year, and which is very exciting. And I think a couple of the newspapers have chosen it as their sort of nature or gardening book of the year. So that's
which is fantastic, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think I'd love to be able to take all the credit, but it's also beautifully illustrated by Lucille Clerc, who's this sort of whimsical French artist who lives in London. And so I think the text and the illustrations, I hope, are siblings.
And it's an interesting time to be talking about this, because we're around Christmas, where lots of people bring in trees and hang up wreaths, and I know from the first book about the trees in particular, you do talk about the role of trees in religion and spirituality and the symbolism of all of that.
Yes, I've tried to weave together science with history and culture and folklore, because to me, that's what kind of makes it interesting. That's what brings these things to life. I remember my grandmother was terribly superstitious, sort of Victorian upbringing, I suppose.
Right.
And she sort of really felt very strongly that there should be a separation of the home and nature, and it was all about keeping nature out. So she wouldn't wear green. She wouldn't have green. Certainly wouldn't have had green wallpaper, and really didn't want plants in the house either. There was a real kind of superstition about that. There are lots of other cultures, as you say, who will bring in wreaths or holly or whatever at certain times of the year, often as symbols of, I think, of fertility. It's a rather bleak time of year. There's not a lot growing, and to have something with bright berries, which are a sign of future life, I think is very attractive. So that's often built into a lot of superstitions.
Yes, well, it's definitely true at Christmas with the red berries everywhere and all that.
And mistletoe. Yeah. Mistletoe is interesting stuff. It's actually a what's called a hemiparasite. It photosynthesizes. It's got leaves, but it plugs itself into trees and then sort of sucks all the goodness out. Right. And but it's got these fantastic translucent white berries. They're very poisonous, by the way, and also poisonous to pets. Right. But the British have really taken to mistletoe because we're a rather reserved lot, aren't we? And it's a sort of excuse to have a quick kiss under it.
Yeah. Well, not so much during COVID times.
No.
Yes.
Well,
health warning.
In your bubble.
Yes, in your bubble. You can be kissing under the mistletoe in your bubble. And I think from your first book, was there anything you talked a lot about the banyan tree in India and its significance there?
Yes, I mean, each tree has a sort of national champion, if you like, or every country has a national tree, and in Finland, the birch tree is the one they've taken to heart, and being very, very fond of democracy, they actually had a vote on it, a national vote in 1988, and they came up with the birch being the sort of national tree, and it wasn't to do with the fact that it's kind of beautiful and it grows everywhere and it can recolonize quickly after ice recedes or after a fire, but because of all that sort of slightly occult witchcrafty association with birch that they have in northern climes. People used to boil the bark for this sort of tarry resin. In fact, betula, which is the Latin name for birch, has the same root as bitumen, and there's this sort of tarry stuff, and we found sort of lumps of this with tooth marks in it, and that people used to use it as a sort of antiseptic chewing gum thousands of years ago. And you sometimes get, you'll see in birch trees, you get these clusters of twigs that have grown in all sorts of crazy directions. They're called witches' brooms in English, and that's caused by actually a fungal infection called tafrina that makes this sort of the plant go completely crazy, and it looks like a bird's nest, but actually it's just sort of jumbled twigs. But again, the association with witchcraft. Right. And then there's this very weird thing with birch trees, is that in common with other trees, they have a symbiotic relationship with fungi that live underground. And fungi are very strange things anyway, but all we really are conscious of are the sort of fruiting bodies, the things that look like toadstools. But actually there's a great network underground of these tiny, tiny microscopic fibres. Yeah. And the trees have this relationship with fungi, where the fungi go out and effectively forage for the tree. They get certain nutrients, phosphates and so on. And in return, the tree gives them the products of photosynthesis, which are basically sugars. And so there's a very happy relationship with the two, and the fungi plug themselves into the roots of the trees.
I mean, it's interesting you talk about the fungi and the sort of network under the ground, and I've been aware of recently, I mean in the past year or two, people talking about the communication networks under the ground between trees, and how actually these things which look rather static and immobile and slow growing, there's a lot more going on generally than we think.
Yes, I mean one of the questions I get asked most frequently after giving talks on trees is about how do trees communicate? And there's a very strong wish in part of the audience to believe that trees have sentience and they do intentional things to communicate to each other. The way that I think it works is like this. The fungi that are plugged into the trees have these networks, underground, invisible to us, that carry the fruits of photosynthesis and chemicals back to the trees and so on. But they also carry other molecules which the trees sometimes use when they're under attack, they'll for example create chemicals that defend themselves from that attack, and those usually waft through the air. And when they waft through the air, they can arrive at another tree, those chemicals, and trigger that tree to produce some of the same defense chemicals. And some of those chemicals can travel through the underground fungal networks, and therefore can act as a signal to other trees to defend themselves.
Right.
And the trees don't have those chemicals sort of on tap all the time, because they're rather sort of difficult for them to make, and it would require lots of energy to sort of keep them there. So they just sort of they produce them when they're needed, when there's a whole sort of swarm of insects or whatever. Now, one could interpret this as the tree signalling to another tree, saying, protect yourself. Or you could see it in another way, that the tree is just reacting, and some of those chemicals are transferred through the network, and another tree reacts. Now, is that intelligence or not? Is that sentience or not? Difficult to say, really, because our definition of what intelligence is not very sort of precise. But I would say that trees are not sentient, but there is a kind of intelligence in the forest that we were brought up to think that it's all, if you excuse the mixed metaphor, dog eat dog out there, and trees are competing each other to fight for light. But actually, there's more altruism than we would think,
right.
Because it's better for the forest as a whole if lots of different species survive and thrive. And so at certain times of the year, when the deciduous trees are really motoring, at the peak of summer, they'll give some of their products of photosynthesis through this network to conifers, which are sort of being outcompeted at that time. And in winter, or at the sort of shoulders of the seasons, the conifers, which are photosynthesizing because they keep their leaves during the winter, they can give some of their sugars to the oak trees and the beech trees and so on. So there is a sort of altruism, but it's not necessarily a sort of sentient thing.
It's interesting. You talk a lot about the science of how it all works, and you sort of popularise that in a very effective way. And I always think that there are these two levels at which people engage. There is this scientific and ecological basis, and we're talking to Leila about the importance of the environment. But also, I remember I was working in Japan for a while, and a man I remember just came up to me one day in the street and went, "Look at our cherry trees. You should look at our cherry trees." And it was really bizarre. You're going, who are you? And he was really proud. And he went, look, isn't this amazing? In a way you think, well, no one in England or Britain would come up and go, hey, look at that oak, man. You think, how weird.
I mean, we would do it in other cultural contexts. So, I think if we saw a fantastic village cricket match going on, and some foreigners were walking by and they hadn't really clocked what was going on. I could imagine in certain contexts, without being creepy, I could imagine actually sort of going up and saying, hey, look at this, isn't that amazing? And for the Japanese, that sort of cherry blossom time in March, April is just incredibly special. And the news broadcasts, they have a sort of report at the end of the news broadcast, along with the weather, saying where the sort of the front has got to, because obviously the blossom starts in the south and then works its way north, as it gets warmer in the north, and people will be reporting on what's the best time to go and view, and obviously it's not just about the blossom, though the blossom is amazing. And the blossom is fantastic because the blossom is there before the leaves. So you've got this sort of bright blue sky potentially, and you've got just dazzling pink and white blossom. It's fantastic. But it's not just about the blossom, it's about a time when people go on picnics together and, a family time. It's a time when sort of businesses kind of require their staff to go on away days. So people will have a strong feeling, either negatively or positively.
Isn't there a Japanese phrase as well, especially for the period about?
Yes, mono no aware, they call it, which is a sort of a joy in
transience or something?
In transience and sort of something that isn't quite perfect, and there's a wistfulness about it. It's not melancholy, but there is a kind of minor key feel to it. Anyone with their roots in Eastern Europe would understand this. It's that sort of taking pleasure in something that you know won't last. Yeah.
Almost because it won't last. It has a beauty because it's there for a special period and then it's gone.
It's ephemeral. Absolutely right. Yeah.
Look, you've written at least two very popular books, so clearly there is a demand for these things, and amongst the people we might know, they like trees and like nature and they engage with that. But it seems to me what's important is to reach out beyond those people. Do you have a sense of how that should be done to reach people who are not currently engaged but we feel should be, or not, should be for a beneficial purpose but might enjoy it, you know?
Well, I'm no expert on this, but the reason I wrote the books in the way that I did was that, you know, there was some basic science which I find exciting, but I knew that the way to really broaden out the audience would be to include as much about folklore and the crazy things that human beings do in the context of the science. So the plants have evolved for their own purposes, but we've made the most amazing, bizarre, poignant, crazy uses of these plants. And I think that the technique with broader audiences is always to think, well, you know, what are the audience's interests? You know, what are the things that they're really keen on? And then you can use that as a hook. So if people are interested in history, then, you know, goodness knows you can talk about trees and plants through, you know, Battle of Trafalgar or whatever with the oak trees, you know, or if people are interested in sport, then, you know, there's you can start with cricket. You know, I mean, there's a lot of plants.
You know,
not least the grass, which seems to have manipulated human beings around the world to plant it wherever. But you know, willow. I mean, it's a way in for people, and I think you always need the hooks, because otherwise people will think, well, that's not for me. That's this other world.
And finally, we were talking to Leila about her views and her friends' views about the future. Do you tend to be optimistic about it or pessimistic? In the past 5 years, maybe a bit longer, there does seem to be a lot more talk about this. Are you optimistic about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm optimistic about the population because I think that people will, you know, especially as the younger generation gets older and gets into positions of power, they'll understand you know, the effect we're having on the environment and the fact that we're all connected. I think there is an immediate problem of kind of leadership or lack of leadership. And, you know, one of the things that's very difficult to ask people to do is to, I don't know, eat less meat or use more public transport or you know, as a society, use less fossil fuel. It's very difficult to ask individuals to do something if you're not asking everyone to do the same thing, because they'll say, well, look, they're doing it. What, you know, what difference am I going to make? And that's why you need really strong leadership. And I think the difficulty with, you know, the political system that we have is that, you know, politicians are, you know, like 600 and whatever it is, small businesses. They all want to stay in business. And they all want to get elected again and so on. And so doing things which are in the short term unpopular is a very difficult thing for people in a democracy to do. And there are some things which in the short term, you know, in terms of climate change, will be difficult. But, you know, some businesses will go out of business and that I'm afraid will have to happen, and we will eat less meat and so on. But on the other hand, we don't have to be hair-shirted about it. You know, other businesses will flourish and great things will happen, but it does need the leadership. Okay,
well, it's interesting, that point about having to change their behaviour. I wonder whether we should give the final word to Leila. You have to come a bit closer because I'll fall off this tree otherwise. So Jon was talking about the need to change behaviour, and you talked about how you think it's important and how your friends engage. But if one said to you, you can't go on holiday as much or fly as much, are you personally willing? Do you currently stop doing things for the good of the world that you'd like to do? And do you think your friends would do and will do that more or not?
Well, personally, I think that if I was asked to do that, I wouldn't really like to, but if it was like a thing that everyone was doing, I would do it. So I think it is just a matter of like how much influence someone doing something has on everyone else. I think it's very much a social thing. Like, if a lot of people do it, there is more like wanting to do it because the people are doing it. So if my friends were doing it, I think I would do it too. But if it was just like me personally doing it, I don't think I would.
It's a complicated things which this short walk has taken us into. But I suppose at a time of hope, both in terms of Christmas and in terms of Hanukkah, of course, as well, finally, I mean, taking all that into account, are you hopeful that all those things you've said will come to pass to create the beneficial change, or do you think it's all too little too late?
I'm hopeful that those things will happen, but I'm sort of sanguine about whether they'll happen quickly enough, because it's always easiest for governments to kick stuff down the line. Yeah. And this is a point where we actually have to take some tough decisions. And, you know, real leadership is about getting people to do the things they don't really want to do, not just sort of getting them to do the things they wanted to do anyway.
Be the change you want to see.
Yes.
Phrase, isn't
yeah.
it?
Yeah.
Brilliant.
I mean, I emphasise that this isn't a party political thing. It's, you know, I'm sure every politician of every stripe would be the same.
Yeah. Brilliant. All right. Well, thank you very much. Well, that was Jonathan Drori, author of Around the World in 80 Trees and Around the World in 80 Plants. So thanks to him, and of course thanks to Leila Khan for her questions and helping me ensure I didn't fall off that tree. And of course, thanks to you for listening. Until next time, happy wandering and take care.
Thank you for listening to the Woodland Trust Woodland Walks. Join us next month when Adam will be taking another walk in the company of Woodland Trust staff, partners and volunteers. And don't forget to subscribe to the series on iTunes or wherever you're listening to us, and do give us a review and a rating. And why not send us a recording of your favourite woodland walk to be included in a future podcast? Keep it to a maximum of 5 minutes, and please tell us what makes your woodland walk special. Or send us an email with details of your favourite walk and what makes it special to you. Send any audio files to podcast@woodlandtrust.org.uk. We look forward to hearing from you.